The voice on the other end of the line was not the voice of a woman who scared easily. That was the first thing I understood, before I understood anything else. I had known Marisol Vega for 10 years, and in all that time I had heard her calm through a kitchen fire, calm through a child's midnight fever, calm through the week my father died when I could not form a single complete sentence. So when her voice came through my truck's speakers, cracked down the middle like a plate dropped on tile, I knew before she said a single full word that something in my life had already broken, and that I was only now catching up to it. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "don't go home, not yet, please." It was 4:52 on a Wednesday afternoon in late September. I remember the exact minute because I was staring at the clock on my dashboard, doing 61 in a 65, the airport shrinking in my mirrors behind me. I remember the particular gold of the light coming sideways through the windshield. The kind of light that makes you think, for just a second, that everything is fine. I asked her what was wrong. She wouldn't say. She only said it again, quieter this time, as if the words themselves cost her something. "Check your cameras first, then decide." And then the line went dead, and I was alone on the parkway with the sound of my own heartbeat and the terrible understanding that the next 4 minutes were going to divide my life into a before and an after. I'm going to tell you exactly what I found on those cameras, and I'm going to tell you what I did about it, which was not what you might expect, because I didn't shout, and I didn't break a single thing, and by the time it was over I didn't need to. If you believe that loyalty should be rewarded, and that quiet betrayal should never be allowed to win, stay with me and consider subscribing to my channel, because this is a story about exactly that. Wherever you're listening from tonight, a parked car, a kitchen at the end of a long shift, a quiet house after everyone's asleep, I'm glad you're here. Let me take you back, because you cannot understand why one phone call meant the whole world to me until you understand who Marisol Vega was, and who she had been long before the day she risked everything to warn me. Marisol came to work for us the same month my daughter Sophie was born. Back then, we lived in a 2-bedroom rental on Thistledown Court, in Concord, a half-hour northeast of Charlotte, in a neighborhood where the driveways were cracked and the neighbors knew each other's business. I was 36 and terrified, the way all new fathers are terrified, and my wife Lauren was recovering from a delivery that had gone harder than anyone promised it would. We needed help, and a woman 2 doors down gave us Marisol's number, and Marisol arrived on a Tuesday morning with her own apron folded over her arm and a spiral notebook in her pocket, and she never really left. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to describe her the way people describe the help, as furniture that cooks, as a pair of hands. She was nothing like that. Within a month she knew which cabinet held Sophie's medication for the peanut allergy. We didn't yet know how serious it would become. She wrote it down in that notebook, along with the pediatrician's after-hours line, and the name of the neighbor with a car, in case she was ever the only adult in the house when something went wrong. Nobody asked her to do that. She simply understood that a house is a system of small, quiet safeguards, and she made herself one of them. She had a habit I didn't notice for years, and then couldn't stop noticing. Every evening before she left, she folded a dish towel over the handle of the stove, always the same way, corner tucked under corner, a small neat triangle. It was nothing. It was everything. It was the mark she left to say I was here, and the house is in order, and you are looked after even when you don't know it. I would come home late from the shop and see that folded towel in the dark kitchen, and feel, without being able to name it, that some part of my life was being held together by hands that expected nothing in return. What I did not know for a long time, what I only learned in pieces over years, in the way you learn the truth about people who don't advertise their pain, was why Marisol was the way she was, why she noticed things, why she flinched almost imperceptibly whenever money and family were spoken about in the same breath. She told me the whole of it only once, on a winter afternoon when Sophie was maybe 6 and asleep on the couch between us. Back in the country she came from, Marisol had a family of her own. A husband, a small business they built together, selling dry goods out of a storefront, with their name painted above the door, and a brother-in-law she trusted like blood. The business did well enough that there were papers to sign, and she signed the ones her husband and his brother put in front of her, because that was what you did, because they were family, because love was supposed to be the end of the investigation, and not the beginning of one. By the time she understood what she had signed, The storefront belonged to the brother-in-law. Her husband was gone in the particular way that shame makes men disappear. And Marisol was on a bus, north, with one suitcase and a spiral notebook she'd started keeping, because she had learned too late that the people who wrote things down were the people who survived. "I don't warn people because I'm brave, Mr. Callahan," she told me that afternoon, not looking at me, folding and refolding the hem of Sophie's blanket. "I warn people because once nobody warned me. I filed that story away the way you file away things that feel important but not urgent. I did not understand then that I had just been handed the exact shape of my own future, and that a woman who had lost everything to a signature was watching my house with eyes that had already seen how this kind of story ends. I should tell you who I am now that you know who she was. My name is Ethan Callahan. I'm 46. I run a mid-sized commercial insulation company out of Charlotte, Callahan Thermal Solutions, the kind of business that never makes the news but pays for braces and family vacations, and, eventually, round-trip tickets so my in-laws can visit for 2 weeks every September. I built it from a single truck and a ladder. I am not a brilliant man. I am a stubborn one, and there is a difference. And the difference is the whole reason this story happened the way it did. My flaw, and I'll name it plainly, because there's no use pretending, is that I trust people the way you trust gravity. Automatically, without checking. I signed things without reading every line. I gave login credentials to people who said the word family and expected that to be enough. I believed that if someone loved you, that was the end of the matter. Marisol had tried, in her quiet way, to teach me otherwise, and I had smiled and nodded and learned nothing, because the lessons that save us are almost never the ones we're ready to hear. And then there was Trevor Mason. Trevor had been my closest friend since our sophomore year at North Carolina State, where we shared a dorm room with a broken radiator and a shared conviction that we were going to build things that mattered. He stood up at my wedding and read a poem he'd written himself about how loyalty outlasts good weather and grown men wipe their eyes. For 20 years, he was the first call when something went right, and the first call when something went wrong. He was godfather to Sophie in every way but the official one. I would have told you, without a flicker of doubt, that Trevor Mason would take a bullet for me. What I didn't know, what I pieced together only afterward, from bank records and the reluctant testimony of people who'd watched it happen, was that Trevor had been drowning for a year and a half. His own company, a mid-tier logistics outfit he'd staked everything on, had been bleeding out slowly since a contract fell through 18 months earlier. There was a banknote coming due that he couldn't cover. There was an ex-wife with a lawyer and a support order he'd fallen behind on. There was the particular terror of a man who has told everyone he's successful and can no longer afford to be found out. I don't say any of this to excuse him. I have spent a long time thinking about the difference between an explanation and an excuse, and I have decided the difference is everything. Trevor was not a monster who woke up one day and chose to destroy me. He was a frightened man who let his fear negotiate his ethics down, one small compromise at a time, until he was sitting at my kitchen table with my wife and a folder full of forged pages, and had somehow convinced himself that it was survival and not betrayal. That is the more frightening truth in the end. Monsters are rare. Frightened people who talk themselves across a line they swore they'd never cross. Those are everywhere, and one of them was my best friend. Here is the thing about betrayal that no one tells you. It is almost never invisible. It leaves tracks. We simply choose, out of love or laziness or fear, not to read them. In the months before that Wednesday, there had been signs, and I had explained every one of them away, with the fluency of a man who did not want to know. Lauren had changed the password on her email, and, when I mentioned it offhand, gave a reason so quick and smooth that I should have noticed the smoothness itself. There had been a phone call near midnight that she took in the garage, and when she came back to bed, she said it was a wrong number. And I believed her because believing her was easier than the alternative. She had started keeping her phone face down on every surface in the house, a small thing, the kind of thing you don't see until you're forced to see all of them at once, arranged in a row, and understand they were never small at all. There had been a change in Trevor too, though it read differently on him. He'd gotten louder about how well things were going, which I know now is the particular tell of a drowning man. He'd asked me, twice, casual as anything, how the company was structured, whose name was on what, and I'd answered him openly because he was Trevor, and there was nothing I wouldn't have told him. I handed him the map to my own house and called it friendship. I tell you all of this so you'll understand that when Marisol said don't go home, some part of me was not surprised. Some part of me had been standing at the edge of this knowledge for months, refusing to look down. I pulled off the parkway into a gas station on West Sugar Creek Road, my hands not quite steady on the wheel, and I put the truck in park, and I opened the security app on my phone. We'd installed those cameras 2 years earlier, after a string of break-ins in the neighborhood. One in the living room, one over the back door, both of them long since forgotten, running quietly in the background of a life I thought I understood. My thumb hovered over the living room feed for a moment. I want to tell you I hesitated because I was afraid. The truth is, I hesitated because I already knew, the way you know a tooth is going to hurt before the drill touches it, and I was giving myself one last second on the safe side of knowing. Then I pressed play. The living room feed resolved into color, and for a moment my brain refused to assemble what it was seeing. There was my kitchen table, the one I'd sanded and refinished myself one summer. There was the afternoon light on the floor I knew by the sound my shoes made on it. And there, sitting across from each other, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, were my wife and Trevor Mason. Between them, spread across the table, were papers, printed pages, a folder, my folder, the navy blue one. I kept in a locked drawer in my home office, the one with our property deed and the business insurance and the copies of documents I'd told exactly one person about in my entire life, and that person was not sitting at the table. That person was standing somewhere else in my house, with a phone in her hand and a decade of loyalty in her chest, deciding to blow up her own life to save mine. I turned the volume up. The audio was thin, the way phone camera audio always is, but I heard enough. I heard Trevor say the word signature, and then say it again. I heard the particular rhythm of two people who have had this conversation before, who are not discovering a plan but refining one. And then I heard Lauren laugh. Not the warm laugh I'd married, but a short flat sound with no light in it at all, and say 7 words that I have carried in my chest every day since. He won't even notice until it's done. And then a beat later, almost as an afterthought, the sentence that turned the ground to water under me. Trevor asked her something I couldn't quite make out, and Lauren answered, clear as a bell, same as last time. He didn't ask questions then either. Same as last time. I sat in that gas station parking lot and did not move for 11 minutes. A man in a pickup pulled up beside me, filled his tank, and drove off, and I did not see him arrive or leave. I was watching my wife's hand come to rest on the back of Trevor's, right there on my kitchen table, next to a stack of paper with my name printed on it, in places I had never put it. And I was doing arithmetic I did not want to do, because same as last time meant this was not a first offense. It meant there had been an earlier time, an earlier document, an earlier version of me who signed something without reading it, because a person I loved had asked me to. It meant the ground I was standing on had been hollow for longer than I knew. I want to be honest about what happened in me in those 11 minutes, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. I did not explode. I did not drive home and throw open the door. Something in me went very still, not the stillness that comes after a storm, but the stillness that comes right before one, when the birds stop and the air changes pressure, and the whole world seems to inhale. In that stillness, for the first time in my adult life, I understood exactly what Marisol had been trying to teach me for 10 years. The people who write things down are the people who survive. So before I did anything else, before I called her back, before I let myself feel the full weight of it, I hit record on my phone, and I saved that footage, and I made 3 copies. My hands were shaking, but they were moving. I called Marisol back. She answered on the first ring, the way you answer when you've been holding the phone in your hand, waiting, dreading, hoping. How long has this been going on? I asked her. I don't know for certain, Mr. Callahan, she said. And then, because she had never once lied to me. But I don't think this is the beginning. I've seen him here before. When you were at the shop, I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was the last person who should go accusing anyone of anything. Her voice broke on that. I understood later that she was talking about her own history, about the years she'd spent doubting her own instincts, because the world had taught her that women like her were supposed to keep their eyes down and their observations to themselves. I asked her why she'd risk her job to tell me. It was quiet on the line for a moment. Then she said something I have turned over in my hands almost every day since. Because you paid me on time every single month for 10 years. Even the month your father died, and you forgot almost everything else. The check was there. Somebody in this house should be honest with you. And I decided it was going to be me. I did not go home that night. I texted Lauren that I was too wiped out to make the drive and was staying at a hotel near the airport. Which wasn't a lie exactly, only not the whole truth. I checked into a roadside hotel on Yorkmount Road, sat on the edge of a bed that smelled like industrial lavender. And I read, over and over, the photographs Marisol had sent me. Pages from her spiral notebook, transcribed onto a fresh sheet in her careful hand. Dates, times, a word she'd overheard and didn't understand but had written down phonetically anyway. Quitclaim. A phrase about moving 40% of the company's ownership into something called a holding trust, and next to it, in her handwriting, 4 words that had apparently been said out loud in my kitchen. Before he gets smarter. The next morning, Thursday, at 14 minutes past 9, I called Diane Kessler. Diane had handled my business contracts for 6 years. She was in her late 50s, silver-haired, with the particular unhurried calm of a person who has seen every way a deal can go wrong, and is no longer surprised by any of them. I told her what I'd seen on the cameras, and what Marisol had written down. She was quiet for a long moment. Diane was always quiet before she was precise. And then she asked me one question that changed the shape of everything. Ethan, she said, whose name is actually on the deed to the Thistledown house, and whose name is on the majority ownership of Callahan Thermal Solutions? Mine, I said. And then, as the ground shifted again, this time in my favor, only mine, I always meant to add Lauren. To be fair, I never got around to it. There was a silence on the line that I can only describe as the sound of a lawyer smiling. Then listen to me carefully, Diane said. Do not confront them. Do not change your behavior. Go to work. Come home. Kiss your wife on the cheek. And give me 9 days. I asked her what she was going to do with 9 days. I'm going to find out how deep this goes, she said. And I'm going to need you to introduce me quietly to anyone in your company who touches the books. Because a scheme like this doesn't live in a folder. It lives in a paper trail, and paper trails have witnesses. There's almost always someone who saw something and told themselves it wasn't their place to speak. I thought about that for a moment. And then I thought of Priya Nair. Priya Nair was 28, our junior accountant, 3 years out of school, and the most careful person I had ever employed. She double-checked things that didn't need double-checking. She flagged rounding errors of a few dollars. I'd sometimes found it exhausting. I understood now that it was a gift. I asked her to lunch, away from the office, at a diner where no one from the company ever went. I told her only that I was reviewing some financials and needed her honest eyes, and I watched something move across her face. Relief, I realized. The relief of a person who has been carrying a stone and is finally being asked to set it down. Mr. Callahan, she said, once we were seated, and she'd decided to trust me. Can I tell you something I probably should have told you 4 months ago? 4 months earlier, she said. She had noticed a wire transfer routed through a vendor account that didn't match any invoice she could find. She'd traced it as far as she could, and it led to a holding account she didn't recognize. Opened under a name she didn't know. A name she later realized was Lauren's maiden name. She'd gone to raise it with the office manager and had, in her words, lost her nerve. I was 28 and 3 years in, and the account had your wife's name on part of it, she said, staring at her coffee. I told myself I must be misunderstanding something. I told myself it wasn't my place. I've felt sick about it every day since. I reached across the table and I did something I had not planned to do. I thanked her. I told her that the fear that had kept her silent 4 months ago was the same fear that keeps good people silent everywhere, and that the fact she was speaking now, to me, was the bravest thing anyone had done for me since a phone call in a moving truck. Then I asked her, gently, if she would be willing to put what she'd found in writing and to speak to my attorney. She said yes before I finished the question. What followed were 9 of the strangest days of my life. I lived 2 lives at once. In one, I was a man whose marriage was ending in slow motion, gathering evidence with a lawyer and an accountant and a housekeeper who had become, without any of us saying so, a kind of counsel of the honest. In the other, I was a husband coming home each evening to a woman who was quietly forging my signature, and I kissed her on the cheek, and I asked about her day, and I did not let my face do anything but the ordinary things a face does. I will not pretend it was easy. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, and there was one night it nearly came apart. It was the sixth evening. Lauren was at the counter, phone face down as always, and something in me, the old Ethan, the one who trusted like gravity and was therefore capable of great rage when gravity failed, rose up so fast I felt it in my teeth. I opened my mouth. I was one syllable away from saying I know, one syllable away from throwing 9 days of careful work into the fire for the momentary relief of watching her face fall. And my phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Marisol. 6 words, as if she had been standing in the room, as if a decade of watching me had taught her to feel the exact moment I was about to ruin myself. Not yet. Let the paper speak. I closed my mouth. I poured a glass of water I didn't want, and I understood, standing in my own kitchen with my heart going like a hammer, that Marisol Vega was no longer just the woman who had warned me. She had become the thing I'd never had in all my trusting, self-destructing life. A conscience that arrived from outside me, at exactly the moment my own gave out. Diane worked fast and quiet, the way she'd promised. She sent me updates in the clipped, unemotional language of a woman building a wall 1 brick at a time. On the 4th day, she confirmed the notary stamp on one of the draft documents belonged to an office whose commission had been suspended by the North Carolina Secretary of State 6 months earlier. Suspended, as it happened, for exactly this. Notarizing signatures that the signer had never actually made. She'd found it the plain way, the way anyone can, by searching the state's public notary database, and the suspension was a matter of public record. That single fact, she told me, transformed the folder on my kitchen table from a private betrayal into something a court would call fraud. On the 5th day, working from what Priya had documented, she traced the holding account under Lauren's maiden name and found 3 small transfers already sitting inside it. Nothing enormous, just enough to make the account look, on paper, like something that had existed quietly for years. And on the 8th day, Diane called me at the shop, and her voice had changed. There was something careful in it, the way you're careful, telling a man news you know will hurt. Ethan, she said, I need you to sit down. The holding trust, the vehicle they'd built to siphon off 40% of my company, had not been opened recently. It had not been opened in the last few weeks, in some sudden fit of opportunity, while my in-laws were in town and my guard was down. It had been opened 8 months earlier. I did the arithmetic slowly, the way you probe a wound to find its edges. 8 months. That meant that back in the winter, when Lauren and I had taken Sophie to the coast for a long weekend and I'd thought, watching the 2 of them build a sandcastle in the January cold, that I was the luckiest man alive. The trust had already existed. It meant that every ordinary evening since, every kiss on the cheek, every how was your day, had been happening on top of a document quietly waiting to eat my life. It meant this was not a moment of weakness. It was a project. It had a timeline. It had been maintained with patience by 2 people I had loved and trusted for the better part of a year. Same as last time, Lauren had said on the camera. I understood now that there might not even have been a first last time in the way I'd feared, that the phrase might simply have meant the earlier, smaller test of my inattention that had taught them how easy I would be. Either way, the cruelty was not in a single act. It was in the duration. It was in how long they had been willing to look me in the eye. I hung up the phone and I sat in my office with the door closed, and for the first time since the gas station, I let myself grieve. Not the marriage, which I understood now had been a performance for at least 8 months, but the 20 years of friendship with Trevor, and the version of myself who had believed that loving someone was the end of the investigation. I let that man go. I did not do it with anger. I did it the way you release a hand you've been holding too long, with something that was almost tenderness and almost unbearable. And then I dried my face, and I opened the door, and I went back to work, because I finally understood what had to be done, and it was not revenge. It was something quieter and far more permanent. On the 9th day, Diane laid the whole of it out on the conference table in her office, and then she leaned back and asked me the only question that was ever really mine to answer. You have enough, she said, to end Trevor Mason, the forged signatures, the suspended notary, the trust, Priya's documentation, Marisol's timeline. If you want to press criminal charges, I can make a call this afternoon. And by next week, both of their lives look very different. Forgery is a felony in this state. I want you to understand that the door is open. Now I want you to think hard about whether you want to walk through it. I sat with that for a long time. I want to describe honestly what was in me, because I think it's the most important part of this story. More important than the cameras or the forgery or the money. Part of me wanted it. I won't lie to you and say I'm too good a man to have wanted it. There was a place in my chest, hot and simple, that wanted Trevor in a courtroom, that wanted Lauren's name in the paper, that wanted the whole world to see exactly what they had done to a man who had never done anything but trust them. That part of me was loud, and it was righteous, and it made a very convincing case. But there was Sophie. Sophie was 22 and finishing her degree 3 hours away, and she still called Trevor Uncle Trev, and she still, God help her, loved her mother the uncomplicated way that children love the people who raised them, before the world teaches them to keep a ledger. And I understood that if I walked through Diane's open door, if I made this a public, criminal, tabloid-shaped thing, I would not only be destroying Lauren and Trevor, I would be handing my daughter a version of this story she would have to carry for the rest of her life. I would be making her a character in a scandal, instead of a young woman with a father who had handled the worst day of his life with something like grace. Revenge, I realized, is almost always a thing we do to our enemies that lands, eventually, on the people we love. No charges, I told Diane. Not because they don't deserve it, because Sophie doesn't. Diane looked at me for a moment, and something in her face softened in a way I'd never seen in 6 years of contracts. That, she said, is the first, genuinely powerful thing you've said in this whole meeting. Restraint isn't weakness, Ethan. It's the only kind of strength that doesn't cost you your soul on the way to using it. She squared the papers in front of her. So, if we're not going to burn their house down, let's make sure they can never touch ours again. And that is what we did. Over the next several days, quietly and legally, I rearranged the foundations of my own life. I restructured the ownership of Callahan Thermal Solutions into a family trust. But not the family Lauren and Trevor had been counting on. I named Sophie as the primary beneficiary, with an ironclad clause locking out any transfer of ownership without her direct, documented consent once she turned 25 3 years away, with Diane serving as trustee in the meantime. 40% of my company would never move anywhere, because it was no longer mine to lose or theirs to take. It belonged now to the one person in my life who had never asked me for anything. I put the Thistledown house on the market. I understood I couldn't close a home sale in a matter of days. That's not how the world works, whatever people imagine. But Diane knew an investor through a colleague, a cash buyer, who could move on a realistic timeline and who didn't need to know or care about the story behind the listing. The purchase agreement was signed within the week. The closing would come weeks later. On the ordinary schedule, such things follow. What mattered was that the house was now spoken for, at fair market value, by a buyer whose name was not Lauren's and would never be Trevor's. And then I did 2 things that had nothing to do with protecting myself, and everything to do with the kind of man I had decided, in a roadside hotel on Yorkmount Road, that I still wanted to be. I set up a standing account, fully funded, in Marisol Vega's name. Not a bonus, not a gift with strings. A foundation. I wrote her a letter to go with it, and I chose the words carefully, because Marisol was a proud woman, and I did not want charity to be the shape of my gratitude. I told her that a woman who had once lost everything to a signature had by her honesty made sure I would not, and that whatever became of my marriage, her job and the roof over her head would never again depend on anyone's goodwill but her own. I told her the folded dish towel on the stove had held my house together for 10 years, and it was long past time somebody held something together for her. And I promoted Priya Nair. I made her our controller, doubled her salary, and put in writing, in language Diane sharpened until it could not be misread, that nothing she had disclosed to me could ever be used against her, and that her job was secure regardless of anything that happened next. A young woman had swallowed her fear and told the truth to the man who signed her paychecks, at real risk to herself, and I was not going to let the world teach her that honesty is a thing that gets punished. The world teaches that lesson too often already. I wanted just once to teach the other one. The missed calls started on the 8th day. Lauren had seen the Thistledown listing go up under a broker's name she didn't recognize. 11 missed calls that afternoon. By evening, 29. Trevor called twice, and then from a number I didn't know. His mother's old phone, Diane later discovered, an increasingly desperate man reaching for increasingly desperate tools. By the next morning there were 38 missed calls, stacked between the two of them like bricks in a wall. Neither of them had realized, was already too high to climb. She had no idea yet how much I had already moved, but she was about to. On a Friday evening at 7:20, I finally answered the phone, and I told Lauren to come to the house. Alone, she came. Trevor's car was not in the driveway this time. She walked in already talking, already halfway through a story she'd built in the car about how I was overreacting, about how the folder on the table had been nothing, about how there was an explanation for everything if I would only calm down and listen. I let her talk. I had learned, over 9 days in a lifetime, the strange power of a man who is no longer in a hurry. When she finished, I set things on the kitchen counter one at a time, without a word. The printed bank records, showing the holding account under her maiden name. The letter from the Secretary of State's office documenting the suspended notary commission. Priya's signed statement. And last, the trust documents, with Sophie's name on them. Already filed, already final, already beyond the reach of anyone in that room. I did not raise my voice. Not once. I want to be clear about that, because I know the version of this story that people expect. The one with the shouting and the broken dishes. And I want you to understand that it went the other way. And that the other way was more powerful than any shouting could have been. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The papers did all the speaking, exactly as Marisol had said they would. Lauren stopped mid-sentence when she saw Sophie's name on the trust. Her face did something I had never seen it do in 23 years of marriage. Not anger, not exactly. More like watching the foundation give out beneath the building, while the roof is still trying to hold its shape. You had no right, she said. It came out cracked. I had every right, I said quietly. It's my name on all of it. It always was. That was the one thing you never checked. She was silent for a long moment. And then, quieter, without the performance, she said something I had not expected. And it is the reason this story does not end with me as a purely wounded man, and her as a purely wicked woman. Because people are almost never that simple. And I would be lying to you if I pretended otherwise. Do you know what it's like, she said, not looking at me, to be married to a company? For 20 years I was Mrs. Callahan, Ethan's wife. At every dinner, every function, I was an accessory to Callahan Thermal Solutions. You built this whole life, and I was decoration on it. Trevor was the only one who ever asked what I wanted. She laughed, that flat laugh from the camera, but there was water in it now. I know it doesn't excuse anything. I know that. But you asked once if there was a way back, and I need you to understand it didn't start with the money. It started with feeling invisible in my own house for 2 decades. I sat with that. And here is the honest, complicated truth. Some of what she said was real. I had built a life and forgotten to make her a full partner in it. I had literally, on paper, never gotten around to adding her name, and I had told myself that was procrastination when some part of it may have been something I didn't want to look at. I had not been a villain, but I had not been blameless either. A marriage that ends in forgery is a fire, and fires need more than a single spark. But real as it was still an explanation and not an excuse, and I had learned the difference at last. You could have told me you felt invisible, I said. You could have told me at any dinner, in any of 1,000 quiet nights. I would have listened. I would have failed at it, probably, at first. But I would have tried. What you could not be forgiven for is deciding instead to make me actually disappear. I stood up. I'm not going to punish you forever, Lauren. I don't have it in me, and I don't want it in me. But I'm also not going to pretend the last 8 months didn't happen. The house is sold. The company is protected. Whatever you and Trevor do next, you'll do it without anything that was ever mine. She left that night. She did not slam the door. That, more than anything, told me she finally understood. There was nothing left in the house loud enough to be worth slamming it over. I heard, in the months that followed, through the handful of people who still spoke to both of us, that Trevor's company finally went under. It turned out that forged documents draw exactly the kind of scrutiny a drowning man cannot survive, even when the intended victim decides, out of the wreckage of 20 years, not to press charges. I did not lift a finger to make it happen. I want to be very clear about that, because it matters. I did not have to. A house built on that kind of foundation comes down on its own. You only have to stop holding it up. Lauren and Trevor did not, in the end, get there happily ever after either. Betrayal is a poor foundation for a marriage. It turns out the person who helped you deceive someone has already shown you exactly what they're capable of. And that knowledge sits in a relationship like a stone in a shoe. I don't know the details, and I've made my peace with not knowing. Their story stopped being mine to follow. I still live in Charlotte, in a smaller place now, closer to Sophie's school for the time she comes home. Marisol still works for me twice a week, though these days it feels less like an employer and an employee, and more like two people who have proven, to each other, that they can be trusted completely, which is a rarer thing in this world than it ought to be. She still folds the dish towel over the stove the same way, corner tucked under corner, that small, neat triangle, and every single time I see it, I think about a phone call in a moving truck, and a woman who risked her livelihood because someone had once failed to risk theirs for her. Now I want to talk to you for a few minutes about what I think all of this actually means. Because I didn't go through it just to tell you a story about cameras and forgery. I went through it and came out the other side, holding a few things I believe are worth passing to you. The first is this: loyalty rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with fireworks or grand declarations. The people at your wedding reading poems about loyalty are sometimes the very ones drafting documents at your kitchen table. Real loyalty is quieter than that. It looks like a woman with a spiral notebook who writes down where the medicine is kept in case she's ever the only one home. It looks like a 28-year-old accountant who is terrified but tells the truth anyway. It looks like the people who show up consistently, ask for nothing, and are still there long before you ever need them to be. Learn to see those people. We are trained by every movie and every song to look for love in its loudest forms, and we miss, sitting quietly at the edge of our lives, the ones who are actually holding us up. The second thing is about trust, and I say this as a man whose greatest flaw was trusting the way you trust gravity. I used to think the opposite of naive trust was suspicion, that the lesson of my story was supposed to be trust no one, check everything, love with one hand on your wallet. I've decided that's wrong, and worse than wrong. It's a smaller way to live. The lesson is not to stop trusting. The lesson is to trust deliberately instead of automatically. To understand that signing your name to something is a sacred act and to read the page before you do. To know that loving someone is the beginning of paying attention, not the end of it. You can keep your open heart. You just have to bring your open eyes along with it. The third thing is the hardest, and it's about anger. Everything in me on that Wednesday wanted to become a smaller and harder man. Betrayal offers you that like a gift you should refuse. It offers you permission to stop being kind, to stop being generous, to treat the whole world as guilty until proven otherwise. And the great quiet victory of my life is that I did not take it. I protected my daughter. I lifted up the two women who had told me the truth. I let my betrayers face the consequences of their own actions without becoming the instrument of those consequences myself. I did not let what was done to me turn me into someone who would do it to another. Because here is what I learned, and it is the thing I most want you to carry out of this. The deepest revenge is not destroying the people who wronged you. It is refusing to let them make you into someone who wounds. It is walking out of the fire still able to be gentle. They tried to take my company, my house, my name. The one thing I would not let them take was the man I still wanted to be. I'm not going to tell you I've forgiven everything. I haven't, and I'm not in a hurry to, and I've stopped believing that healing requires me to. What I will tell you is that I stopped needing anything from either of them. An apology, an explanation, a reckoning, in order to feel that my life was mine again. That freedom didn't arrive the day either of them was held accountable, because in the way I would have wanted, neither of them ever really was. It arrived the day I signed my daughter's name onto that trust, and understood that everything I had built now belonged, at last, to the people who had actually earned a place in it. If this story meant something to you tonight, take a moment to subscribe to my channel and stay for the ones that are coming, because I have more of these, and I think you'll want to hear them. And before you go, do something for me. Think of the person in your own life who told you a hard truth when it would have been so much easier for them to stay silent. The one with the spiral notebook, the one who was scared and spoke anyway. Tell me about them below. Who is the Marisol in your life? I would truly like to know. Pay attention to the quiet ones. They are, almost always, the ones holding your whole house together in the dark. This story was written and told by a person, shaped by hand, sentence by sentence, from a lifetime of watching how people love and fail, and occasionally rise above both. The names, the places, and the details have been changed out of respect for privacy, and any resemblance to specific real individuals is coincidental. But the feeling underneath it is real, and the lesson is one I believe in with my whole chest. Thank you for spending this time with me. I don't take it for granted, and I'll see you in the next one.